The Great Spaghetti Experiment. It was a Tuesday morning in Mrs. Wobble's class, and something strange was going on. Instead of books and pencils on their desks, the students found spaghetti. Not in bowls. Not in plates. Just a tangled, messy heap of uncooked spaghetti on each desk. "What's going on, Mrs. Wobble?" asked Timmy, peeking over his pile of noodles. Mrs. Wobble, wearing her usual rainbow socks and a hat that looked like a giant mushroom, smiled mischievously. "Class, today's lesson is physics." The class gasped. "Physics? With spaghetti?" "Yes, indeed," Mrs. Wobble said, her eyes twinkling. "We're going to discover the amazing laws of spaghetti." Little Susie raised her hand. Mrs. Wobble, I thought physics was about forces and stuff, like how fast things fall." "Exactly, Susie. But today, we're learning about the force of spaghetti slingshots and spaghetti tower construction." Everyone's eyes widened. Slingshots? Towers? With noodles? Mrs. Wobble handed out rubber bands. "First challenge, build a spaghetti catapult. See how far you can fling a marshmallow using your noodles." The class erupted into a frenzy of creativity. Timmy tied spaghetti together like a bow and used a rubber band as a launcher. He placed a squishy marshmallow in the middle, pulled back the band, and whoosh! The marshmallow flew across the room, landing in Billy's hair. "Bullseye!" Timmy yelled, pumping his fist. Billy shook his head, trying to shake off the sticky marshmallow now tangled in his curls. "Next up," said Mrs. Wobble, "the Spaghetti Tower Challenge. Who can build the tallest spaghetti tower that can hold an eraser on top?" The kids got to work. Susie's tower was wobbly at first, leaning like the Tower of Pisa. Timmy's tower kept collapsing every time he tried to add an extra noodle. Meanwhile, Billy, still pulling marshmallow bits from his hair, was carefully constructing a noodle skyscraper. "Careful, careful," he muttered, balancing an eraser on top of his tall spaghetti tower. The class held their breath. Just then, Mrs. Wobble's pet hamster, Captain Nibbles, escaped from his cage and zoomed across the floor. The class watched in horror as the tiny hamster darted right towards Billy's tower. "No!" Billy yelled. But it was too late. Captain Nibbles, clearly excited by the spaghetti chaos, ran straight into the tower. Noodles flew everywhere, and the eraser bounced off the hamster's head. Captain Nibbles, unbothered by the destruction, snatched the eraser in his tiny paws and scampered away. The whole class burst out laughing. "Well," said Mrs. Wobble, "I think we've learned a lot about physics today. Mainly, that hamsters and spaghetti don't mix." At the end of the day, Mrs. Wobble smiled at her class. "Tomorrow, we'll learn about chemistry, but don't worry, we won't be using spaghetti. Just maybe exploding slime." And with that, the class cheered, already excited for the next wacky adventure in Mrs. Wobble's wild world of science.